I think one sort of cost-effective way of doing that is sort of networking within the community and finding lawyers or compliance folks who might be willing to serve in an advisory capacity, and who will, even if they can't, sort of strictly speaking, provide legal advice on the specific product, can provide sort of a generic roadmap that will give people sort of help them locate and craft a policy. So I think that's sort of one thing. I think a second is to sort of make sure that expectations are set correctly. In financial service, it's important to recognize that it's a heavily regulated business. I mean, it's probably the most heavily regulated business in the United States, with the exception of pharmaceuticals. So your relationship as an entrepreneur to legal and compliance issues in financial services, you should think of as a marriage, right? Like, you're in it and you're not getting out of it until you decide to do something else. It doesn't go away. It's a question of how you sort of manage it and how you plan to manage it. So I think instead of thinking about it, the regulatory issues as, well, let me figure out what the solution is and then I'll do that and never contend with them again, you need to think about sort of managing them and planning for the possibility of shocks, right? In the sense that whatever you think about your explanation as to why you don't trigger state level or federal level regulatory requirements, the regulator might take a different position, and you need to be prepared to grapple with that. So I think about it more like poker, right? Like you need to understand what the rules are in advance. You should have people who can help you understand how to play whatever cards you get, and then the ones that sort of appear, just thinking about Hold'em, right? As you start flipping them over, because you'll have outs, and you'll need to decide at various points which ones you want to take, and frankly, which ones you don't. So this is the sort of in the Valley. I think the way that idea gets sort of reduced to bumper sticker or Twitter length is seek forgiveness, don't ask permission. And the example in the financial services world that people like to point to is PayPal. And it's interesting to me because even though I came sort of later to the PayPal story, I didn't start working with them until just about 10 years ago, actually. So about a decade or so removed from the founding period, have spent a fair amount of time sort of thinking about their origin and how they managed through the regulatory challenges that they faced. And I don't think of it as a choice between asking permission and seeking forgiveness. They had a regulatory strategy. They thought they could avoid being a bank, and adopted a couple of different sort of regulatory positions, and eventually found those positions challenged by two state regulators around the time that they were going public, in New York and Louisiana, both of whom wanted to know why the business they were operating wasn't an unregulated bank. And the decision that they made at that point then was to adopt a different regulatory charter, which was a money transmission license. And were then ultimately able to persuade state regulators that they weren't a bank, that they were in fact a money transmitter, one, and then two, that the underlying account structure that they were using provided consumers with pass-through FDIC insurance on the funds that sat within the PayPal system. So neither of which were precisely what they had been doing before their status as the possibility of them being deemed to be an unchartered bank had appeared, but which were sort of viable alternatives to being deemed a bank. Like, that's not just sort of start and then fix, right? Like that, those are deliberate choices made, as it turns out, by an executive team, which had somebody who's still sort of, practicing and very much sort of a dean of non-bank financial services law, John Mueller, one, two, but by a group of people who at least two of whom, and I believe a third, were lawyers, right? So, Peter Thiel and Keith Rabois, who were critical members of the early executive team, are both Stanford law grads, right? Like, so people with a reasonably sophisticated understanding of what legal requirements were generally, but specifically in financial services. Figuring out what your regulatory strategy is going to be is going to take a fairly significant devotion of resources. As the product itself is gestating, as you're sort of thinking about what your MVP is, I would think that you're probably going to spend, at least 25% of your time, maybe even as much as 50% of your time, sort of working through that and coming up with sort of an MVP from a regulatory standpoint. And then on an ongoing basis, sort of, monitoring and maintaining it, probably somewhere between 5 and 20% of your time would be, my rough guess. Co-founders, it's not like each of you is devoting that much time, but roughly one person on the team is probably going to be spending about that much time. From a capital perspective, at some level you're always trading time for money. So if you want to reduce it, you're either going to give some of your cap table away to somebody who's going to help solve this problem. If you do it through an advisory relationship, probably not a significant portion of the cap table. If you choose to sort of rent the time, it doesn't need to be the most expensive proposition. So one of the things that we've tried to do is, we've actually built a retainer product, so it's $7,500 a month. For all intents and purposes, all you can eat for core product and sort of low-level interaction with state and federal regulators. If something starts to move into sort of more of an adversarial direction, then you're sort of going to pay by the hour. But at least at the firm level and personally, we want to help people solve these problems, and we're willing to make an investment and want, frankly, to reduce friction in that relationship so that people can feel like they can pick up the phone and talk to somebody and get questions answered without having each of those sort of appear on a timesheet or a bill. I see there are two versions of this. So one frequent mistake is we know that somebody else is doing something like what we're doing, and they're doing it this way, so we're going to do it this way, and we're not actually going to talk to a lawyer. That frequently ends in tears. A second mistake, and I certainly try to avoid this, and this is part of the reason that we've tried to come up with relatively easy ways of working with founders, is people can frankly overinvest in coming up with a regulatory strategy, right? The perfect can become the enemy of the good, and they can spend a lot of money trying to secure legal permission to do something, ultimately to find out that they can't acquire customers cheaply enough or generate enough money from those customers to make the initial investment in a legal or regulatory solution worthwhile. And so, I think thinking about the advice that we try to provide people and to live in how we work with people, if that sort of makes sense, is build a regulatory strategy that is compatible with the product at each life stage. Don't try to solve every problem at the beginning. Solve the ones that are necessary to get the business off the ground, and understand, the things that create sort of significant personal or professional or corporate jeopardy, and solve those, recognizing that there may be things that that you either didn't identify or couldn't have foreseen at the time. I think those are critical. And then the last, and I think this is just someone who continues to believe in the viability of the rule of law. Act in good faith, and people will be willing to work with you, including regulators. I mean, I guess a sort of corollary of that is that people shouldn't think of regulators as their adversaries in the process of building a company. They're frequently allies. They're open to, and frankly, if you approach them the right way, happy to provide advice. The CFPB, for example, with Project Catalyst, makes a point of coming to Northern California and New York and other sort of entrepreneurial centers and meeting with entrepreneurs who are offering products in their space. And even though other regulators don't necessarily have the same sort of outreach, they're open to those same conversations. So operate in good faith, seek advice, listen, and then make calculated judgments.